One of my favorite parts about doing what we do in this day and age is that we get to hear all the stories from the people who worked on the albums that we would have never got to hear years ago. If they weren't interviewed for a magazine, if we didn't buy that magazine, if it wasn't some specific little sliver of the amount of things that went down that got published, we would never ever know about it. So a lot of guys back in the day, engineers talk about how they used to have to like, just make it a point to meet up with each other, talk to each other, figure out what other people were doing on other sessions, and almost trade notes. Like, I worked on this session, I'll give you these notes for what do you got? You got that. And engineers, especially in like Manhattan, would meet up in the subway area after they would get done at the studios and share notes. I just love that, hearing that, because we sort of do the same thing today, but it's way easier for us. So we have to take advantage of that. A great example of this, The Color and Shape, an album by the Foo Fighters that I grew up loving. When I was a little kid, I remember just being blown away by how good it sounded. And it takes all these years now for me to hear, stories about how it was done and methodologies that I want to incorporate into my own workflow that I want to share with you guys. Stuff like, I was talking to an engineer friend of mine today, and I was basically just shooting the shit with him about like Brendan O'Brien's mixes. And on that album, Chris Sheldon did it, but he brought up that album, but it came from me asking about like, man, I referenced some Rich Costey mixes, when he did Audio Slave, and I referenced the Brendan O'Brien, Revelations album that he did, and they both sound so good. And I was just like, we were talking about the overall how wide they sound. They just sound like they take up so much space. And then, it's like, well, they were both using SSLs. And then you go down the path of, well, there's also something else to it. And I was all ears, because just, I mean, I don't know about you, but have friends who are mixing engineers. If you're a mixing engineer, it helps so much just to be able to bounce ideas off each other and just to talk about nothing. Every once in a while, you get ideas from just talking about nothing. He knows a guy who is taking some of Brendan O'Brien's mixes and trying to convert them to Atmos. And in doing that, because Brendan O'Brien used tape to print his mixes, in other words, it was recorded however it was recorded. Let's just take that out of the equation for now. Obviously, it was tape, right? But that's not the point. He's running the whole session through the desk. He's mixing on the desk. Then he prints to tape. Now, by having tape as that last stage and hitting it as hard as he was hitting it, the tape was doing something to the sound that would make it where he had to do a little bit less than a lot of us have to do if you're mixing all digitally, for example, and not using tape, in order to tame the vocals, for example, in order to make the S's not so harsh. So what this guy was running into when he was dealing with these Atmos mixes, which were digitized, he's pulling them up and going, we have to de-ess this. We've got to make it less harsh. We've got to change. Like, we can't just put this out, because there's another step that happened in this process that made this mix what it is, and that's not this. So we got to deal with that. According to him, what he said, was that Brendan O'Brien used to say things like, if you like if you like the mixes now, just wait a few days. They'll sound even better, because the tape would sort of change. It would, in other words, he was so dialed in, and I find this so interesting. He was so dialed into what he was doing, Brendan O'Brien, that he would mix a certain way into the tape that would then, he could predict what was going to happen later. So he might hit it especially hot and especially bright, for example, and to get a certain result, knowing what was going to happen a few days later. I just found that so interesting, and that typically a certain amount of time would go by before it would go from that to the next stage in the process. So he was always sort of ahead of the curve with what he was doing, I think, is the way I look at it. So dialed in, and basically so aware of his process and his mediums of what was going to happen. So he was able to overshoot with the understanding of what would happen. And never did he think that these things were gonna be digitized and then used that way and that he should have to plan for that. So this tells me so many things. It echoes one very small point that I just want to bring up, which is that you should never ever like master or create and make your stuff for these ridiculous streaming standards. But I'm only going to talk about this for 10 seconds because this isn't the point of the video. But the point is, don't do that. Don't do what they're saying about aim for a certain amount of lufs or loudness, or because that's going to change. It's going to be totally different, and there's no reason to do that. Just aim for it to be as good as possible when it's listened to wherever it's listened to, all right? Especially when there's none of that, whatever's taming it and happening on one service or another. And like, don't do that, because who knows what will happen in the future. And those things may not be around. They might, they may not. And then you don't want to have this ridiculous version of your stuff. But it also just puts me onto this other tip, which is like, maybe there's some logic here in that what you can get with having tape on the end, right? And we're not going to go dig up a tape machine. I don't know about you, but I'm not, okay? I'm not going to go do that. What if we just put like a Studer or an Ampex or something on the end, at the end of our chain, as if that's where we're printing to, and we purposefully darken it up a bit down there. Like we don't do what a lot of people do, which I even do sometimes, which is use like the Studer A800 plugin and then brighten some top end on it. And then have to actually do less on all the tracks. Maybe we should work this other way. Maybe that the old school Brendan O'Brien style of knowing that there's going to be tape on the end, which has a tendency to sometimes roll off some top, and then maybe hit everything in such a way where we can crank more and we can do less. You know, he wasn't using de-essers on every freaking channel like some of us do now. Like he was just not doing that because it was happening at the end, which is why when that got removed from the process, now all of a sudden everything's too bright and painful. So this brought up other ideas too that I want to talk about, which is, you know, The Color and the Shape by the Foo Fighters. Chris Sheldon was basically told by Dave Grohl he doesn't want any compression on his drums. And if you've heard that album, you know how good it sounds. I mean, in my opinion, it's on the level of it should be everyone's reference, or at least if you have the same taste as me, it should. And everybody probably doesn't. But the point is, I love the way that sounds. I love the way the drums sound. And the drums on My Hero especially are amazing sounding, and those are double tracked. If anyone didn't catch that, they're double tracked drums on there. It just shows how tight Dave is, and to be able to perform the same thing twice and make it sound that stellar. I mean, amazing. What? Crazy to think about. But let's talk about why that album sounds so good. The drums are not compressed at all. There is bus compression. And around the time of that album, you would have printed to tape. There's a great interview on the Produce Like a Pro channel about 6 or 7 years ago where he goes into this, and they talk for a while about it. But the points that I found really amazing were what he did instead of compressing drums in order to pull up the punch of the low end of it. And he had to come up with a way to do it, which is my favorite part about who we are. We are problem solvers. So Dave Grohl goes, no compression. And Chris is like, okay, I'll make it work. So he's sitting there, and mind you, he's got some good gear. He's got a Neve sidecar, probably had some 1073s in it, maybe 1081s or something, but he's got the sidecar, and what he winds up doing is parallel EQing. Now, there's some guys that will talk about parallel EQ. I've heard it before. I believe Chris Lord-Alge parallel EQs guitars, and you could find him talking about stuff like that. So like the chorus comes up, and you've got your ability to push up some oomph in the guitars on a parallel fader, essentially, that is just EQ'd a little more aggressively, potentially, so it cuts. And now what we got from Chris Sheldon is he's doing parallel EQ on drums, and one of the channels boosting just the lows. So if he wants more oomph out of it, he's got that on a parallel. And then if he wants more air and transient off the top, you know, some point on the toms, point on the snare, point on the kick, he's boosting, you know, let's say 4K and up. And that's it. He's just got one fader for 4K and up, one fader for the down at the below, and just riding those two when he needs to in things like choruses or, explosive bridges to compete with the guitars to get them to punch. And that's what he's doing on the guitars. He's doing this on pretty much everything, if I'm not mistaken, because he found that it worked. So it was like a fix for drums that he wound up also using for other things. And he would use those EQs on the Neve sidecar as inserts on the SSL. So it's just an interesting workflow, like not laying into compression, laying into parallel EQs used as inserts. Okay. So, very interesting concept. Everybody, in my opinion, should try this at least once because the way the drum sound is phenomenal. So if you can get that kind of drum sound by just using a little bit of SSL bus compression, 4-to-1, little bit of work there and no other compression, I think you're doing a lot. So he said a big part of the sound, Chris Sheldon was saying, was hitting the tape so hard. Now that's the same theme from what I started talking about with Brendan O'Brien. He would go through these processes of mix the song without doing too much on each channel, but he'd hit the tape super hard, which would do a thing and kind of tuck it all in, round it out, not make it too pointy. So as soon as you take that tape out of the picture, these mixes in Atmos need work. So, need work, not like they're bad mixes. Brendan O'Brien's listening to the final product through the tape machine going, this is great. So this is done. But it's no longer the same mix. That's why also you can't mix with stuff on your mix bus and then all of a sudden decide to take it off when you send it to mastering or something. Now they don't have the same mix. It's crazy. Leave the stuff on, all of it if you could help it. Some guys battle with this for years and decide, I'll only take off one limiter or I won't take off any, or I'll only take it off if the mastering engineer yells at me enough. Or there's no amount of right wrong here, but I've heard people people who have great careers talk about that they still battle with the idea of like, should I take off the last limiter or not? And every time I do, I don't like it, but the mastering engineer's got no headroom. It's so funny to me how things like this just keep coming up and nobody ever really has an answer, right? And there is no answer because it's what you like. So that's why there's no answer. But let's go back to a solution now. I don't know if this would work or sound good at all because digital is not the same as analog in the least, but I'm going to try on my next mix because I like trying things. I'm going to try no parallel compression on the drums and no compression on the drums. Like I'm not going to compress anything. I'm going to pretend Dave Grohl's standing over my shoulder going, waving his finger. And what I'm going to do is just do the mix bus compression. And I'm going to put a Studer A800 last, at the very last plug-in on there. I'll put the limiter after it. I probably put the limiter after it. I may experiment with it both ways, but I probably will. Otherwise, I don't see how I could keep everything from going into the overs like crazy. So I guess I'll go limiter last. And the Studer, I like the A800 a lot, but I may go with the Ampex. I'll put that right before it, the limiter. And I'm going to not do what I would typically do, which is like add some highs and not boost much on each channel. I'm going to take all the highs off, or at least just leave it set at something kind of dark. I may roll highs off using, the tweakability. And then I'm just going to boost more. I'm going to mix into it, and I'm going to crank more up without using as many de-essers and let the end handle it. Like, see what happens. Let's let that tape handle it in the way that, Brendan used to let the tape handle it. And Chris Sheldon used to let the tape handle. Let's let the tape handle it and just see what we get. See how the result is. I'm sure we're not going to come up with a new form of rocket fuel or something, but at the same time, let's be positive. Let's see what will happen. But especially, let's lean on the no compression on the drums thing, because that is cool, and I dig that. And that album sounds heavy. It doesn't sound like the drums have no compression on them. But they don't, and they don't have any samples on them either. So what a feat to make that album sound the way it does. And when you need a little more life out of your guitars, have that parallel EQ. Like, let's lean on some parallel EQ which is, we like the sound of those records so much from a certain period of time. So much of it has to do with the fact that they had less tools. So they couldn't overdo things because they had no choice, but also because they were hitting certain things super hard that we don't really have the ability to hit today, unless you're going to go dig up a tape machine, and make sure it's in good working order. I mean, it's just, so we don't have the ability to do certain things that would create a sound like that. So this also led me down a path of, if I'm referencing stuff that is done using tools in a way that I'm not going to be able to recreate, like, ever, without those tools, it would be so, I mean, it has to be different because the inherent nature of that process is going to create a different result than no matter like what we do. But I guess it's not bad to use them, but as long as you realize it's still going to be, you have to make it your own no matter what, and don't ever think it needs to sound exactly like that. But what it made me realize is when it comes to using references, it might help a lot to use your own references that are really good, like some mixes that you've made that are very good, especially if it's on that project. It becomes a very helpful reference to, like, if you have 4 or 5 songs you recorded all in the same place, get one of them great. No matter how many times you got to go to the car and compare whatever to whatever, get one great. Then use that as your reference instead of others. So you may have to use other references just to get the one great, but then use that, because I think you can get way more in the ballpark of, what's possible, because it is probably not possible to create that sound of hitting tape super hard like that. But I'll give you another solution of a way that might do it. Try this. It's a simple one. Put something like a preamp on every channel, like as your first plugin of your mix, and mix up the kind of preamp. Use an API preamp on a bunch. Use the Manly tube preamp. I love that one on a bunch. Use, if you want to use the Neve preamp, use some Neve preamp stuff. Just run it across your whole mix on the first channel of everything, like not on your mix bus. And the sum total of that will probably do a little something for you. If you, just group them all so you could take them all on and off and pop them in and out, I bet you'll hear a big difference. The Waves NLS bus is like the NLS channel, which is also like the NLS bus plugins, like those might do something very, very similar. And if you don't want to use those or want to try something else, some sort of saturation on every channel. The guy I was talking to, who's a good buddy, is, great engineer, talking to me about the Phoenix plugin, the Dave Hill Phoenix plugin on that was what he tried on everything as the first plugin that really sort of opened up the mix a lot also. So there ain't no right, ain't no wrong, but just try these kind of things, because that may actually be better than hitting the end thing hard. But I'm going to try them all. I'm going to, I've tried the preamp thing first. It's one of my go-to ways of doing things. I really like the Manly tube preamp as like the first plug-in, because you can get a lot out of that. But just try these things, all right? And specifically, mess with that end thing. Darken up the tape a little on the end, and then mix into it and make it as bright as you want by mixing into it brighter. And let me know how it goes. Any other questions, answers, throw it in the comments. Like, subscribe, leave a comment. I appreciate it. Talk to you soon. Evan Jaffe, you guys got this. Take it easy.